Agroforestry and silvopasture are concepts that work well with a lot of farms. To have a canopy of trees that supply your animals with shelter also breeds the perfect environment for water retention, and therefore easier and better conditions in which to grow feed for your livestock. But what if you don't have a canopy of established trees to begin with? Trees take years and years to get established or to reach any kind of notable size, right? Wrong. There's an old method of encouraging tree growth that's made a recent resurgence, and it's called the Miyawaki method. Grow trees 10 times faster, get 100% more biodiversity, and make it so incredibly dense that you'll actually end up with so much plant matter that you need to send animals in there to clean it up for you. And you can get all that in just 2 to 3 years. Don't believe us? Well, the science behind the Miyawaki method is actually a lot simpler than you think, and is being implemented all across Asia and Europe to encourage reforestry projects on the continent. Akira Miyawaki was a Japanese botanist and expert in plant ecology, as well as a dedicated activist to reforest the planet after commercial agriculture and lumber production has destroyed so much of the world's natural forests, grasslands, and jungles. In the 70s, Akira had a look at why all of the millions of trees being planted to replace lost forests weren't quite repopulating the way they expected them to. We had all the ingredients in place to make it work after all. All of the millions of dollars, countless trees, and more than enough volunteers, yet we weren't seeing the results that we bargained on. Entire plantations of new saplings were dying, and this whole movement to reforest the earth was going to fail completely if we couldn't figure out what we were doing wrong. And what we were doing wrong is planting trees according to agricultural laws, and not those of nature. You see, when we plant an orchard, the trees are spaced out neatly for optimal growth and room for their roots to extend out as far as possible. Before those trees are planted, we clear out the land completely, chuck down a bunch of fertilizer, and place them into neatly spaced beds. But in the forest, everything grows all over each other. There, under the canopy of trees, a human thing like spacing and cleaning the ground before a tree can sprout doesn't exist. No patch of ground is without some kind of coverage. If there isn't a tree or a bush growing, then the space is filled up with grass, moss, flowers. There's always something growing. And the food all of those plants need comes from above when the higher growing trees shake off their leaves, when an animal dies and rots, or when a flower has spent all of its energy and gives up for the season, leaving more biological matter behind when it dies off. Within all of that chaos, there is constant life, and life feeds life. And finally, the fact that the plants that have been growing there naturally for thousands of years has just as much to do with the equation. If a species of tree wasn't there 100 years ago, why on earth would a tree from another country or continent be comfortable growing there then? Just because the weather conditions might be similar to a tree's natural environment doesn't mean the same goes for the conditions underground. You'll just never get the kind of fast growth from a patch of trees that are not natural to the area as you would from those that should have been there in the first place. So that's what Miyawaki did. At the beginning of spring, he took a patch of open soil right in the middle of a busy city, just a few feet in diameter, and threw down a bunch of manure and mulch. Manure to fertilize the otherwise empty soil, and mulch to simulate the natural layer of dead plant matter that would normally cover a forest floor. He then planted as much of the local bush, tree, shrub, and weed varieties into that little space as he possibly could. And then he simply walked away and left nature to do the rest. In just 3 years, there were trees reaching more than 8 feet tall. The tiny forest had weeds, flowers, and shrubs. And what little space might have been left bare was now covered with moss. And in that tiny 100 square feet, birds, rodents, and more bugs than could possibly be counted had made their homes. In the middle of a city, with no help from the outside world. Now, Miyawaki has since then adopted the technique somewhat by adding water in the beginning stages of making a new tiny forest, just to give those fresh saplings and seeds a little help to get them started. But the method really is as simple as that. A whole new forest, just because he kept to the plant sorts that were native to the area. Since then, it's been implemented within cities in France and Britain to create tiny forests right in between the cars and buildings and people. Countries like India, Pakistan, and the United States went even farther. They've used the Miyawaki method to completely replant lost forests with enormous success. But what does all of this have to do with farming? Most native species in your area don't give off food. Not for you or your animals. Besides a canopy of trees for shelter and better water retention, it doesn't really solve the problem of creating more food now, does it? Well, that's where the second change to the system comes in. Be selective about what you're putting down. If you really have a look at the naturally occurring trees in your area, there will be more edible varieties than you thought. The same goes for the weeds, flowers, and bushes, especially as animal feed. Let's take a state like Montana, probably the state in the USA with the most homesteaders and small-scale farmers in the country. Chokecherry, hawthorn, serviceberry, and mountain ash are all very populous trees that are native to the state, and all of them are edible for animals. Bitterbush and common juniper are bush varieties that make for good fodder. And finally, the weeds, pearly everlasting, dandelion, lamb's quarters, knotweed, and wild mint aren't just edible to livestock. They're medicinally beneficial to prevent parasite infections, digestive problems, and they're all high in nutrition. And we're just talking about Montana here. Could you imagine having an acre available to work with? Or even just a few square feet at a time? And you don't have to plant 100% of your workable space with native species. Bring that number down to 60% and fill the rest with grains, berries, or maybe a few fruit trees. Just the fact that more than half of that ground is retaining water and nutrients is going to be enough to feed and water the rest without any of your help. Besides that first season's help with fertilizer and a little bit of watering, you won't ever have to put any labor into it ever again. Besides letting your animals go through it from time to time, of course. This opens up a whole new world for rotational grazing. These tiny forests, as long as the native species are the majority of what's growing there, will produce at the very least 70% more fodder than any other method. After the first year, watering becomes unnecessary. And if your livestock are going through it once every quarter, they'll leave behind enough fertilizer to make up the nutritional aspect of things. And if you think we've oversimplified the Miyawaki method, we really haven't. Besides the small scale, tiny forests in cities across the world, places like Pakistan, India, and the US have all applied the method to larger 10 to 20 acre plots too. In America, several Native American reservations are currently in the process of revitalizing their forests to bring in more wildlife and therefore more hunting grounds. Not only is it working, it's working better than any other reforestation project has since the 50s. Purely because Miyawaki had the sense to go back to the very basics. Neat lines and intensive watering schedules, chemical fertilizer and fences, overthinking and overplanning. These are all human ways of thinking. Nature doesn't work that way. Nature lets things run their course as they would have without human intervention. And as we've seen with the Great Dust Bowl, the current insect and microbial life depletions, chemical pollution both in the soil and in the water, humans have a habit of thinking nature to death and causing more havoc than any natural disaster possibly could. Go out and get your hands on the weeds and trees that you've been trying to eradicate from your properties and let them grow, thrive, and feed your animals in as little as 3 years. And while you're at it, add a few fruiting trees in there to feed yourself too. You don't need a gazillion acres to make it happen. The Miyawaki method makes it possible to implement this in the average backyard, on the sidewalk square, in the abandoned lot. No space is too small to grow food. Or what do you say? Are we being too enthusiastic about these marvelous tiny forests? Well, the stats don't lie. Less effort, a fraction of the time to get established, and all if you can just let Mother Nature do what she does best. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. As always, it's your engagement that keeps us going. Without you, we couldn't do what we do. Thank you to every like, comment, and sub.